I'm George McMillan from Impact Analytics. Today we're going over slide set 2 of a development of unified theory of the philosophical and social sciences. It's about 100 slides long, subtitled The Importance of the Hume-Smith versus Marx-Engels Research Design in the Generation of the Overarching Philosophical Architecture of Unified Theory and the Significance of the Per Capita GNP Ratio in Unifying the Key Macro Social Scientific Frameworks. Abstract. This slide set explains that if the methodologists in areas of politics, economics, and demography can focus on the integration of these three subject areas via the per capita gross national product ratio, signifying economic growth over population growth proportions, as they relate to first, second, third, and fourth world country outcomes, then Gintis' objective of the unification of the behavioral sciences will be completed. The process of completing the unification of the macro social scientific frameworks will operationalize the parallel areas of foundational, political, and economic philosophy as well, and would complete a unified theory of the philosophical and social sciences in the process. Once this is understood, then the aim of a true interdisciplinary program should be in the completion of the larger objective of the unified theory of the philosophical and social sciences, which would advance more areas of philosophy. Section 1, the development of a core model of the social sciences. This section explains the efficacy of comparing the competing foundational political and economic hypotheses of Hume-Smith versus Marx-Engels models to derive the philosophical causal architecture to achieve a unified theory of the philosophical and social sciences. This process also achieves Gintis unification of behavioral sciences while extending the ICM of Tooby and Kosmides throughout the micro and macro philosophical and social sciences. Section 1 focuses on explaining how the ex post analysis of the great ideological experiments of the 20th century can be achieved in the context of the original a priori Hume-Smith versus Marx-Engels foundational political and economic hypotheses. This ex post analysis provides the overarching causal philosophical architecture represented in a Cartesian style XYZ axis continuum set. The overarching philosophical architecture provides the information necessary for the theoretical reformulation phase of the scientific method applied to ideological theory. The causal architecture provides the insight necessary to align A. Tooby and Kosmides, 1992, concept of the integrated causal model of socio-biological and evolutionary psychological theories, to Fromm's productive versus sadomasochistic character orientation dichotomy, to C, the proper and perverted forms of Aristotle's 6 forms of government, which links to D, the virtuous and vicious long-term economic cycles depicted by the per capita GNP ratio signifying economic growth over population growth proportions, which varies directly to the outcome measure of the 4-category geopolitical form model consisting of first, second, third, and fourth world countries. This system of social scientific empirical frameworks represents the reformulation phase of the post-industrial modern theory. Longer papers were presented at Eastern Economic Association Conference in February 2006 in Philadelphia on behalf of the Society for Advancement of Behavioral Economics, and more recently at the Institute for Interdisciplinary Social Economic Sciences in May of 2015 in Amsterdam, September 2017 in Vienna. While the detailed analysis of the great ideological experiments is left for the main slide sets in the papers, suffice it to say here that it's the philosophical architecture that will be paralleled with a system of evolutionary, psychological, political, economic, and demographic geopolitical form model frameworks to complete the theoretical reformulation phases of past global development theories and therefore follow the 3 phases of the scientific method. With this understanding of applying the scientific method to the human studies, the works of Hume and Smith are pictured in the foundational political and economic order in the next slide. treatise of human nature, inquiry into human understanding, dialogues concerning natural religion, inquiry concerning morals, and essays moral and political, and for Adam Smith, theory of moral sentiments, lectures on jurisprudence, lectures on rhetoric, and the Wealth of Nations. The Hume-Smith model can be characterized in three-dimensional forms as the z-axis represents a gradation of non-empathy and sympathy versus empathy and sympathy in society. The y-axis continuum represents the method of mass political organization and the level of mass antagonism or cooperation engendered by the type of government forms and the elite mass relation tendencies. The x-axis represents the growth, non-growth, equity dichotomies of the fundamental per capita GNP ratio, C plus I over G over N people. Likewise, here's a Marx literature review matrix. Principal works is Frederick Engels, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, The Communist Manifesto, and Karl Marx, Das Kapital. And here's a slide of more of their major works. Okay, the Marx-Engels model can be characterized as the z-axis represents the level of destructive self-interest elicited by the market-driven competition versus the level of altruism elicited in a non-competitive non-market system. The y-axis represents the level of antagonism versus cooperation engendered by the government forming the elite mass relations tendencies. The x-axis represents a growth versus non-growth equity dichotomies. However, in a Marxist system, it derives from C plus G over N people format of the centrally controlled system with no private investment, so there's no I. We'll explain in much more detail in the papers and in the future slide sets the operational political aspect of the Marx-Engels theory. The distribution of resources by the linear programming method is impractical in a billion by billion matrix. Linear programming didn't work. Therefore, the political distribution of resources did not have the objective efficiency Marx intended. The communist experiment, therefore, suffered the consequences predicted in the Austrian socialist calculation debates, disconfirming the Marx-Engels series of hypotheses and confirming the hypotheses of Mises and Hayek instead. The premise of the Austrian school has been updated in the constructive versus ecological dichotomy of Vernon Smith 2007, which is the common causal theme of the philosophical and social sciences. The effect of the constructivist planned political economies have routinely devolved into systems of gross political favoritism, extensive coercion, and black market corruption, which operates on a free market basis wherever communism has been attempted. The effect of inefficient and non-objective political distribution and government investment was disastrous to technical innovation. Despite the development of numerous theoretical mathematicians by its educational system, the shifting of resources towards new inventions was not practical in this system that was designed to limit production of goods for high-end markets that serve elite clientele, which are the consumer preference guinea pigs in free market systems. Without an effective technical innovation market preference feedback loop to guide investment, the communist bloc countries fell far behind the Western technological gains and labor productivity growth. It is the outcome of communist and Marxist social experiments in Latin America where it can be said that the effect of Marxist ideology on human nature leads to a destructive behavioral dynamic. The shifting of institutional power from the people who organize other people, i.e. the bourgeois society, for the transformation of raw materials to consumer products and distribute them to free markets is the essence of economic production and is successful in a free market society. In contrast to the people who organize other people to organize politically, the essence of socialism for the distribution of resources via mass bureaucracies has been disastrous wherever it's been attempted in the past and will be in the future. Therefore, this model is based on the Hume-Smith, Adam-Smith, Vernon-Smith over Malthus model of explaining the effect of belief systems on human nature as it relates to economic production over population growth proportions, which is pictured in the thumbnails next to the slide. The significance of this very brief discussion of the Hume-Smith versus Marx Engels analytical research design is that A, it provides the overarching causal theme for the philosophical and social sciences. B, a significant number of works in the philosophical and social sciences can be discarded as invalid. This leads to C, this method leads to the simplification of the philosophical and social sciences across the micro and macro behavioral spectrum. The next section explains the selection of the primary psychological, political, and economic frameworks and the four-category geopolitical form model as the outcome measure of the system explained in the introductory slide set. An important aspect of the Hume-Smith versus Marx Engels research design is that it's in the foundational political and economic order. It's therefore designed to operationalize all three major areas of the discipline of philosophy with the per capita GDP-based economic growth theory and demographic statistical models, making it a rigorous area of study that is actually tied to real-world behavioral political, behavioral economic, and behavioral geopolitical models. The more one understands how this research design integrates the foundational political, economic, and geopolitical ends of history, which are the behavioral expectations of a belief system in the discipline of philosophy, the more one will realize the importance of integrating the macro frameworks of Aristotle's 6 forms of government to economic growth over population growth projection models to the 4-category geopolitical form model, which then incorporates Pomesi, Dime, SWOT, and political risk analysis under one singular system. Ultimately, the more one will see how the predictive advantages of this system. The focus of the slide set group, consisting of approximately 9 slide sets, is to operationalize 2/3 of the subject areas of the discipline of philosophy that would also assist the world's financial and intelligence analysts the most. Since this research design already integrates evolutionary psychology and post-Freudian psychological aspects of the model to the macro frameworks, one can begin to see why focusing on the macro frameworks as the first step in operationalizing a significant portion of the discipline of philosophy and can operationalize the remaining areas over time, bringing them to the information age era also. Hence, the focus of the first slide set group is on the more immediate integration of Aristotle's 6 forms of government, economic growth theories over population growth projection models to the 4-category geopolitical form model, which then incorporates Pomesi, Dime, SWOT, and political risk analysis. The integration of the macro frameworks would operationalize 2/3 of the discipline of philosophy and begin to reverse the negative effects of postmodernism in the philosophical and social sciences, while also assisting real-world analysts the most. With the understanding that evolutionary psychological and post-Freudian psychological aspects of the model are already integrated qualitatively, the focus of integrating macro frameworks would advance the Baconian Cartesian scientific methodologies in philosophy to turn it into a rigorous science, which was Husserl's objective in 1911. And here are the thumbnail slide sets. Okay, section 2. Extending the ICM of Tuvia and Kosmides and developing a baseline equation for the philosophical and social sciences. Section 2 explains the full scope of the project in terms of the transition of the physical sciences that end in the discipline of biology and begin to transition to the social sciences in the subject areas of evolutionary biology, sociobiology, and neuroevolutionary psychology, which is the basis of the ICM of Tuvia and Kosmides. In context of the ICM, the research design focused on developing the integrated explanatory model equals the 4-category geopolitical form model system to extend it throughout the philosophical and social sciences. This section zooms out to explain the whole philosophical and social scientific landscape as a means of explaining why the integration of the macro, political, economic over demographic, and geopolitical frameworks will provide the material to create a unified theory of the philosophical and social sciences as a precursor to developing a baseline equation of philosophical and social sciences over time. The research design of Section 1 compared the centrally planned constructivist systems against the decentralized ecologically based systems in terms of the behavioral dynamics they produced. This is an effective means of determining the confirmed macro-political, economic over demographic, and geopolitical forms. Once a series of confirmed frameworks was selected, it was recognized that the system can be integrated via the per capita GNP ratio. It was this deduction that narrowed down the missing areas of research to completing the unification of the behavioral sciences to the coordination of the area of foundational philosophy and psychology, as explained in the triple trifecta project section of slide set 1. In the landscape of foundational political and economic philosophy, it's essential to understand that the area of foundational philosophy has divided into two distinct areas, the areas of post-Darwinian evolutionary theory and post-Freudian psychological theory. In this landscape, it is important to understand that the physical sciences end in the area of biology and the social sciences begin with the transitory area of biological evolutionary theory as it drifts to the relationship of biology and formation of culture, which co-evolved to promote self-survival and survival of the species in socio-biological and evolutionary psychological theories. The transitory disciplines of biology and the various aspects of post-Watson and Crick socio-biological theory are the subject areas that discuss the connection between biological needs of humans as organisms and their outward behavior in securing those needs, which are expressed by Maslow's hierarchy of needs. As humans conduct the observable behaviors of the two primary motivations in anthropology of pursuit of resources and mates, and the two observable primary motivations of human behavior in economic theory, the pursuit of economic gain, Downs 1957, and social status, Veblen 1899, as discussed by Harsanyi in 1966. The twin motivations of observable phenomenon of the pursuit of resources, mates, and anthropological theory, and the pursuit of economic gain, social status, and political economy naturally translates to the two abstract primary motivations of the pursuit of self-survival and survival of the species in Darwinian evolutionary theory. Over time, the various social sciences have evolved in relatively isolation under the standard social scientific model, but nevertheless developed a strikingly similar set of primary dual motivations that span the entire spectrum of the social sciences, i.e. from evolutionary theory to anthropology to sociology and political economy. Conceptually, the existence of the twin motivations indicates that the disparate theorists in separate disciplines recognized a common behavioral theme and presented their frameworks according to that theme. In following this common theme, the formation of societal institutions was designed to facilitate the meeting of Maslow's hierarchy of needs as people are pursuing resources and mates. It is this insight of the common system of twin motivations in the context of meeting Maslow's hierarchy of needs that provides the concrete foundational basis of paralleling of philosophical and social scientific theories. Advanced techniques of any human behavior are merely the fundamental recombination extension of fundamentals. In terms of flowcharting, the alignment of foundational political and economic philosophical theories to a series of Darwinian evolutionary theories as it relates to post-Freudian psychological theories as they relate to political, sociological, economic theories and demographic statistical models, that is the landscape of the sciences required to meet the objectives of E.O. Wilson and consilience. In context of this flowchart of the micro and macro frameworks is that the psychological, political, and economic behaviors have produced the two primary trends of technology and population growth, placed in terms of the category of first world, second world, third world, and fourth world countries, as the means of tracking the trends and changes in political forms that follows. The goal is to explain this reality of geopolitical forms in terms of a system of micro and macro frameworks that accounts for the prevailing trends of post-industrial era phenomenon. In order to align political, economic, demographic, and geopolitical forms in terms of the two primary trends and two secondary trends depicted in Professor Robert Vogel's chart to the right, it made sense to modify the subjective first, second, and third world country classifications to 4-category systems that is consistent with the gradations of the 2 categories of more developed and less developed countries. The more one examines the 2 primary trends of technology and population growth, which have given rise to the 2 secondary trends of migration of manufacturing facilities south and the migration of people to the north, the more one will realize that the world is going through a global wage-labor equilibrium process. Furthermore, one comes to realization that this global wage-labor equilibrium between more developed and less developed countries has been occurring over the past several decades and is compelling political and geopolitical changes. The linkage of Aristotle's 6 forms of government to the 4-category geopolitical form model was developed as the outcome measure system framework to better illustrate the interaction of political, economic, and geopolitical frameworks that will be occurring under the present high population growth conditions of the latter half of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. The problem is that few of the social sciences use methodologies at all, and the ones that do are not integrated when they could be. The chief problem is that the landscape of the philosophical and social sciences is a misunderstood concept which obfuscates the areas of confirmed and unconfirmed knowledge. Hence, these opening slides explain the landscape of the human studies to familiarize the reader with the major elements of the research design. The zooming in and out of the landscape is a means of inventorying the project in terms of what areas are systematized and which areas need to be systemized, need to depict the overarching pattern, and need to depict the overarching patterns of human behavior. It is this process of understanding the overarching patterns of human behavior in terms of the frameworks that best describe the full range of phenomenon, then slightly modify them to better account for prevailing trends. It's this process of focusing the project to prioritize feasible goals. Since the goal of the system is to align the environmental shaping disciplines, it made sense to use Tubin Kosmides ICM as the existing evolutionary platform, which narrows the project to development of a system of environmental shaping disciplines. The environmental shaping disciplines are represented in the integrated explanatory model concept consists of Fromm's Biopolis, Necropolis, productive sadomasochistic dual continuum psychological theory in the anatomy of human destructiveness, 1972, as the initial independent variable position. The political framework of Aristotle's 6 forms of government is in the central independent variable position of the model, and the per capita GNP ratio is a dependent variable position, and the 4-category geopolitical form framework is the outcome measure of the system. This configuration completes the ICM plus IEM equals 4-category geopolitical form model system in qualitative terms, which is presented in the slide set series, but will need to be placed in quantitative terms over time. The explanation of how Fromm's psychological framework is selected for the initial independent variable will be bypassed for now to focus on the macro frameworks. The verification of the psychological framework requires a separate psychometric method and needs to be done in a separate slide group of its own. The purpose of this explanation of the lateral integration of disciplines is to explain how the IEM equals 4-category geopolitical form model was developed in qualitative terms that extended the ICM of Tubin and Kosmides and needs to be completed in quantitative terms over time. This is an example of there's ample existing specialty field expertise that can accomplish that and do not realize the wide range of external validities of their knowledge. With the expectation of moving to a quantitative system, the system of quantitative explanatory theories is placed in a Cartesian-style system. Keeping in mind that the macro system consists of the central independent variable of Aristotle's 6 forms as it relates to the dependent variable of economics, as it relates to the outcome measure system that tracks the 2 primary trends of technology and population growth and the 2 secondary trends of the migration of mass manufacturing facilities to the south and migration of people to the north, as this causal string relates to the 4-category geopolitical form model that defines first, second, and third world countries in terms of a z-axis of low to high effective education rates, a y-axis of low to high economic growth rates, and an x-axis of low to high population growth rates over time. In this system, first world countries can be defined as a z-axis of effective education rates, y-axis of high economic growth rates, and an x-axis of low population growth yielding a tight wage labor market price condition, a high relative income equality rate, and a high financial, economic, and political stability rate. The correlation here is a relatively tight wage labor market price, a relative income equality, and a system of financial, economic, and political stabilities vary directly together. Since this phenomenon varies directly together in the real world, it makes sense to depict this reality in a singular system. And the singular system necessarily leads to a laterally integrated system of political, economic, demographic, and geopolitical frameworks. The bottom line here is that all the frameworks vary directly with each other according to the per capita GDP ratio symbolism of economic growth over population growth proportions. The next slide sets will define the other categories. Second world countries are defined as a z-axis of moderately high effective education rates, a y-axis of moderately high economic growth rates, and an x-axis of low population growth rates over time, yielding a moderate wage labor price market condition with moderately high income equality rate, and moderately high financial, economic, and political stability rate. Third world countries are defined as a z-axis of moderately low effective mass education rates, moderately low economic growth rates, an x-axis of high population growth rates yielding a low wage labor market price condition with low relative income equality rate and moderately low financial, economic, and political stability rates. Fourth world countries are defined as z-axis low effective mass education rates, a y-axis of low economic growth rates, and x-axis of high population growth rates over time, yielding a catastrophically low wage labor market price condition, which with catastrophically low relative income equality rates, a catastrophically low to high financial, economic, and political stability rates, or high levels of instability. The conclusion of aligning the macro behavioral frameworks, it was realized that the common behavioral element was a constructive versus destructive behavioral dynamic. In combination with the tight versus catastrophically loose wage labor rate for the common themes, this allowed the modification of frameworks to become compatible and therefore integrative. And lastly, by placing the outcome measure system in a Cartesian-style system allows the methodological community to start integrating the macro frameworks and then work on the micro frameworks later. In closing this section, the significance of the four-category geopolitical form model in terms of the history of long-standing objectives is the illumination of three elements to meet E.O. Wilson's criteria of consilience, the unifying principle of knowledge, and complexity, the underlying principles of a causal schema that are listed in the next slide. The three elements of consilience and complexity are the constructive versus destructive behavioral dynamic premise that integrates the behavioral aspect of psychological, political, and economic theories, Aristotle's six forms of government as the central behavioral model of the philosophical and social sciences, and the per capita GDP ratio simplification representing the Hume-Smith over Malthus hypothesis of the past, and modern growth theories in proportion to contemporary demographic models. And the per capita GDP ratio is the most versatile qualitative to quantitative framework in the social sciences. When the three elements of consilience and complexity are linked to the four-category geopolitical form model as the outcome measure, the cause of string of comprehensive behavioral frameworks represents an effective means of developing a common core model, or signed in 1960, is global development and underdevelopment to advance modernization and convergence theories. This type of synergistic interdisciplinary modeling will prove to be increasingly useful in the cooperative and defect game theoretic modeling strategies of PMISI, dime SWOT, and political economic risk analysis used in private and public sectors, and should be integrated into a singular schema and mathematized if a form of interdisciplinary researchers can be created to advance the project to the next level. The roots of this model in terms of modernization theory will be explained in the next section. Section 3. The roots of the system in modernization theory. Section 3 explains how the lateral integration of frameworks evolved from modernization theory based on the integration of political and economic growth theories. Modernization theory occurred alongside the economic development and takeoff theories that were in vogue during the 1960s during Kennedy's Decade of Development and Johnson's Great Society programs during the period of post-war optimism in the United States. However, global population growth has been outpacing economic growth ever since, and the transition of third world countries to first world status has never occurred. The integration of political, economic, and over-demographic frameworks related to the four-category geopolitical form model was developed to describe this phenomenon. This system was conceived in context of modernization theory concerning the integration of political and economic development theories of Lipset, Rostow, and later Pravorsky. It merely made sense to correlate the political and economic development theories of the two primary and two second trends into the four-category geopolitical form models. The problem with the earlier form of modernization theory is that they simply didn't go far enough methodologically of only trying to integrate political and economic forms. Cartesian systems require the linking of an independent variable to a dependent variable and an outcome measure. The result of the integration of political and economic frameworks, the result was, in this model, I integrated political and economic frameworks to the geopolitical form framework to complete the system. The goal of modernization theory and convergence theories was to develop the LDCs to merge them with the MDCs over time, especially in the post-World War II era decolonization and the subsequent Cold War race over the development of the underdeveloped world. It was in this era of development that occurred in terms of the capitalist versus socialist and communist ideological experiments. This context of the Cold War ideological experiments has a much deeper behavioral aspect concerning the effect of belief systems on human nature. While this greater question of analyzing the effects of belief systems on human nature will be dealt with in the main slide set series, this slide set is focused on coordinating the micro and macro behavioral frameworks first, as the means of coordinating the closely related areas of political, sociological, and macroeconomic, demographic, and geopolitical studies first. Since the macro frameworks were all integrated via the per capita GNP ratio, it is a convenient point to begin with the unification of the behavioral sciences, as Gintis phrases the concept. In this endeavor of integrating political economic frameworks with geopolitical outcomes, it was already explained why it was beneficial to modify the traditional first, second, and third world countries and put them in place of a more objective four-category system to establish an interactive political, economic, over-demographic, geopolitical system. It should be understood that the modification of the subjective three-category system to a Cartesian-style four-category system was done as the means of correlating Aristotle's six forms of government to macroeconomic demographic proportions, where it becomes clear that the economic growth effectiveness and ineffectiveness determines the rise of production and living standards as explained by Rostow's takeoff and growth theories, while Baumol's sectoral development explains how the expansion of economic sectors determines if the rest of the population is included or not included. The concept of economic takeoff and development theories to explain development as a total concept is contingent on whether the population growth is slow enough for rigorous economic growth to absorb the population, leading to a tighter wage labor market situation with higher levels of relative equality and stability, or whether the population growth will outpace economic growth and produce growth without equity. The growth without equity problem, as frequently discussed in the various editions of Wilbur and Jameson's series of books, The Political Economy of Development and Underdevelopment. In terms of developing troubleshooting schematic, the problem of development and underdevelopment can be placed in the three categories of the troubleshooting model. The problem of underdevelopment could either be an ineffective economic ideology, corrupt political system that inhibits economic growth, or it could be the result of rampant population growth that outpaces even the most robust economic growth, or could be a combination of all of the above. Placing all three problems into a singular schema is possible with the expanded use of the per capita GNP ratio representing economic growth over population growth proportions. That is the crossroads of the subject areas of economics over demographics, economic production over aggregate supply and demand theories, or economics and in-person polity. The ratio is the crossroads of the macro disciplines, allows it to become the troubleshooting schematic of a much more comprehensive system, which then integrated Aristotle's comprehensive government form model, integrated with economic demographic-based geopolitical form model that corresponds to the real-world outcomes of first, second, third, and fourth world failed states. The development of a cross-disciplinary troubleshooting model of modernization theory also advances the closely related areas of economic and convergence theories. The relationship of the per capita GNP ratio to the four-category geopolitical form model discussed earlier, whereas the section will elaborate on the importance of Aristotle's six forms of government in this system. First, Aristotle's six proper and perverted form categories of elite versus elite rivalry dynamics and elite mass relationships that the government form categories represent covers the full range of constructive and destructive behavioral dynamics, which is the working premise of aligning psychological, political, and economic theories in this model. Secondly, it explains the full range of elite versus elite and elite mass relationship forms is capable of incorporating all the major political and sociological subfield theories. Thirdly, the preferable democracies seem to only exist in the higher effective education rates of the z-axis, the higher economic growth rates of the y-axis, and the lower population growth conditions of first and second world countries in the x-axis. Fourthly, the less preferable forms of oligarchy and tyranny seem to exist in countries with lower effective education rates, lower economic growth rates, and higher population growth conditions of third and fourth world countries. It should be mentioned here that Aristotle's six forms of government has three dimensions to it. The first dimension is the constructive versus destructive behavioral dynamic in terms of the proper and perverted form categories as it merges with the virtuous and vicious longer-term economic growth cycles or convergent long wave theories, and the facilitative or debilitative theories in psychology as explained in Maddie 1971. This behavioral dimension integrates the entire system of social scientific frameworks on the behavioral basis. The second dimension is that stable democracies only exist in relatively tight wage labor market conditions. This third dimension is that all the macro theories occur as an outgrowth of men and women pursuing resources and mates in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which are the subject area of evolutionary theory and the fundamentals of philosophical and social scientific theory. The four criteria of Aristotle matches the first, second, third, and fourth world categories, which places the political and economic geopolitical frameworks in a compatible economic growth over population growth proportions measurement format. The three dimensions of Aristotle's six forms allows the political, economic, and geopolitical frameworks in a positive and negative behavioral dynamic format, but the economic growth both the economic demographic proportions and the constructive versus destructive behavioral dynamic continuums are required to effectively integrate the macro frameworks. You need two dimensions. The following charts depict the integration of Aristotle's 6 forms of government with the neighboring disciplines. In this chart, the value neutral forms are in the center. The rule of the one, rule of the few, and rule of the many. The proper forms of government on the left side, aristocracy, monarchy, and constitutional democracy. The perverted forms are on the right side, tyranny, oligarchy, and mob rule democracy, which typically degenerates quickly into martial law to restore order. Here's the constructive versus destructive behavioral dynamic premise that integrates Aristotle's 6 forms of government with economic indicators. In the proper forms, the working assumption is where the rulers rule in the interests of the ruled. Typically has high investment, high multiplier coefficient, high Gini coefficient characteristics. And that's true of aristocracies, monarchies, and constitutional democracies. In the perverted form, where the rulers rule interests of themselves, they typically have low investment, low multiplier coefficients, low Gini coefficients, and are tyrannies, oligarchies, and mob rule democracies, which degenerate quickly into oligarchies and tyrannies. So the consensus scale rises and falls with investment. Okay, this chart integrates Aristotle's 6 forms of government with psychological theories. Psychologically, where the rules, the proper forms, where the rulers rule in the interests of the ruled, they typically have high investment, which is a manifestation of a facilitative character orientation dynamic or productive character orientation dynamic. And that's the categories that include monarchy, aristocracy, and constitutional democracy. In the perverted forms, where the rulers rule in the interests of themselves, they're more extractive, so they have low investment, and debilitative character orientations or sadomasochistic character orientation dichotomy. And that is typical in tyrannies and oligarchies, or a mob rule that degenerates into lawlessness and goes back to oligarchy and tyranny, and a reduction in the consensus scale. Okay, here's this chart. Laterally integrates frameworks. It has the ICM of 2B and Kosmides related to a behavioral dynamic, to a psychological dichotomy, to Aristotle's 6 forms of government, the per capita GDP ratio, technology and population growth, the 4-category geopolitical form model, and the Mises and Dime analysis for stability and instability and power levels measurements. Aristotle's 6 forms of government allows the lateral integration of political and economic and geopolitical form frameworks based on the tight versus catastrophically loose wage labor continuum, signifying economic growth over population growth rates of change, and the constructive versus destructive behavioral dynamics. In concluding this section, Aristotle's 6 forms of government models the most comprehensive elite versus elite and elite mass relationship form framework. It's the most comprehensive elite versus elite and elite mass relationship framework in the philosophical and social sciences that explains the full range of human behaviors and readily integrates with psychological theories on the micro side of the model and per capita GDP, economic and geopolitical forms on the macro side of the model. Section 4. Using the macro frameworks to explain why some democracies exist and others fail. Analyzing Chavez Venezuela and the need for a Pareto-style success parameter models in explaining political and economic development theories and outcomes. A further significance of integrating Aristotle's 6 forms of government to the per capita GDP ratio and the 4-category geopolitical form frameworks is comprised in the macro framework system was done to answer the central question of modernization theory of why do some democracies exist and why do others fail. This was the central question of post-World War II modernization theory and should be revived as the two primary trends of technology and population growth and the two secondary trends of job migration to the south and people migration to the north, combined with the amount of personal, local, state, provincial, and national debts soar in the Western democracies amidst the declining wage equilibrium process that's occurring globally. First, the soft social sciences have a means of establishing more concrete measures of correlating tight versus loose, catastrophically loose wage labor market rate scales to high and low relative equity scales to low to high stability scales. The advantage of the singular system is to develop a congruent behavioral pattern among micro and macro behavioral disciplines to advance predictive trend analysis in the philosophical and social sciences as a whole. The reality of the 20th century great political experiments is that the liberal democracy, as discussed by Fukuyama in 1994, only exists in relatively tight wage labor market conditions, and this reality should be reflected in a singular model. There simply needs to be a system that explains why some democracies exist and others fail. The Latin American style social experiment strongly indicates that the failure of social democracies has something to do with the shifting of resources away from production in a non-centrally planned bourgeois system to the shifting of resources to consumption in centrally controlled, highly regulatory, and high redistributive socialist systems. All the prerequisites to mathematize all three areas of philosophy with hard modeling standards exist in this system. The goals of Bacon, Descartes, and Hume of the past correlate to the goals of Orsini, E.O. Wilson, Tuvia, and Kosmides, and Gintis of the present. Secondly, the success-failure models can be used to improve the predictive aspect of the geopolitical national power measurement scales of PAMISI, DIME, SWOT analysis, and move from correlation criteria analysis to an explanatory theory in Pareto-style system of equilibriums and optimums that are much more predictive of the effect of the two primary trends of technology and population growth and the two secondary trends of manufacturing jobs moving to the south and mass migration of people to the north over the coming decades. The two primary and two secondary trends will be changing polities and geopolitical national power ratings as the two primary and two secondary trends will be changing the various tight versus catastrophically loose wage labor gradation thresholds of several countries and whole regions of the world at a time over the next 2 decades. The world's political and economic risk and intelligence communities get their methodologies from the social sciences, and the social sciences simply need a framework of analysis to better anticipate the changes that the isolated theories of the standard social scientific model cannot. The conclusion is that the laterally integrated system of theories has wide-ranging applications in several closely related real-world analytical research areas. The wider scope of the integrated macro behavioral theories in the four-category geopolitical form model establishes success-failure parameters for democratic systems of government, as it will be demonstrated in the slide set series. This system of correlated theoretical and empirical frameworks has the potential to be far more predictive in depicting first, second, and third order effects of persistent trends than isolated subfield theories under the present autarkic standard social scientific model. Furthermore, as it will be explained in the slide set series in great detail, the side benefit of laterally integration of macro behavioral frameworks is that it adds scientific methodologies and measurement systems to the soft philosophical and social sciences that have thus far avoided scientific procedures. The problem in the soft philosophical and social sciences is that they have tended towards idealism under an autarkic standard social scientific model, as discussed at length by Tuvia and Kosmides, and tended away from the realism as discussed by Hooray 1994. The effort here is to add the realism to empirical modeling model building under a more rigorous integrated causal model framework. The point of contention is that the soft philosophical and social sciences have steadily been advancing interest group articulation and proportional representation arguments and a belief in democratic systems of government without an adequate explanation of successful and enduring democratic experiments, in contrast to unsuccessful and non-enduring democratic experiments. The Chavez and Maduro, Chavez and Maduro were elected via democratic processes in Venezuela with a great source of petroleum as revenue and still failed. Ostensibly, the petroleum revenues could have been devoted to internal sectoral development and greater domestic diversification to guard against fluctuations in oil prices. The drop in petroleum prices were predictable as new sources of petroleum were coming available at a time for a variety of reasons. Hence the need for predictive Pareto-style models that produce a variety of different courses of actions, and the advantages and disadvantages of each course of action to explain the opportunity costs and trade-offs associated with each course of action. Pareto-style models of equilibriums and optimums are closely related to the seven-step military decision-making process. The lack of scientific models in the idealistic soft philosophical and social sciences has led to fourth world failed states recently and will continue unless interdisciplinary success-failure parameter models are developed. Without well-established Pareto-style models, the Chavez and Maduro regimes increased ill-conceived entitlement and redistribution programs that led to financial, economic, and political instabilities in Venezuela in the quest for a socialist utopia funded by international petroleum revenues. The Chavez and Maduro regimes could have increased domestic import substitution investment to build a core domestic economy to guard against international petroleum price fluctuations. But that course of action was not weighed by the regimes of radical Cuban Marxist advisors who learned nothing from the 20th century great ideological experiments. The opportunity and trade-offs of Venezuelan petroleum revenues was tremendous and foreseen by neoclassical economic analysts all over the world. The Venezuela experiment demonstrates the need for Pareto-style models in the soft philosophical and social sciences, where a multitude of soft study academicians thought that Chavez Venezuela socialist experiment was going to be an enduring system, when the analysts on the cable financial shows predicted the inevitable disaster. The point is that the liberal democratic forms of government may be preferable to tyrannical forms, but preferability does not raise a particular government form or ideological system to a deity to believe in. Democracies only exist in relatively narrow range of behavioral economic growth over demographic growth proportions. This reality from comparative political and economic ideological systems analysis should be reflected in the singular model. The lessons learned from the 20th century great ideological experiments and the 20th century lesson learned from Venezuela is that sometimes the systems lie within a series of psychological, political, and economic demographic parameters and are sustainable and stable systems, and sometimes democratically elected systems lie outside the psychological, political, economic parameters and prove to be unsustainable and unstable systems. The goal of this laterally integrated model is to better understand the sustainable versus unsustainable parameters in an open form of discussion. In moving towards the conclusion to this slide set, the unification of the behavioral sciences should begin with coordinating the disciplines that already use Cartesian-style systems and Bayesian statistical models. The use of Aristotle's 6 forms of government linked to economic growth theories and population growth models linked to the 4-category geopolitical form model as a system of frameworks where each framework explains the entire range of positive and negative human behaviors. Integrating this finite area would significantly move the idea of the unification of behavioral sciences from a notional idea to a feasible project. The coordination of integrating the macro political, economic, demographic, and geopolitical frameworks will advance the philosophical and social sciences in the process, as the constructive versus destructive behavioral dynamic of Aristotle's proper and perverted form, elite versus elite rivalry dynamic model, directly parallels post-Freudian theories as demonstrated by Maddie's several editions of personality theories and comparative analysis, first appearing in 1968 and going through several expansions over time. By focusing on the integration of political, economic, demographic, and four-category geopolitical form model first, i.e. the central macro frameworks in this opening slide set, the obligatory SMART objectives can be established, so the unification of the behavioral sciences doesn't seem like a bridge too far. The reality is that the project is extremely feasible with a relatively finite number of people meeting in a common forum. With slide set 3 and 4, we'll explain the full context of the model for completeness. Slide sets 5 through 9 will return to the narrowed scope focus of modernization theory in an effort to synchronize the world's interdisciplinary methodologists to the more immediate problems of global convergence theory. And this will conclude the slide set presentation for today. We hope that you join us for the next slide set series. Thank you.